Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Tiny Experiments. So for this one, the layout of the wrapper program that encapsulates these tiny experiments is a little bit different than normal, and you'll find over the next few episodes I'm going to experiment with a few different menu layouts because the nature of the experiments and what we're experimenting with will change. In this episode, it's primarily experimenting with changing out the questions. I'll explain what we're doing in a moment in terms of the overall thrust of this, although you've probably guessed from the thumbnail, it's about self-reflection in LLMs. And we're achieving that in this particular set of experiments by doing two passes on the same LLMs with an initial question and then the reflection question. So as you'll see here, and I'll go through all of these in a moment, I'm not going to run everything, but I will run the basic functionality so you can see how it works. But the idea is, once you've played around with it, mess around with the questions and mess around with the reflection prompts. And so these are grouped together in different types of reflection. Now the other thing in here, and I've simplified this slightly from my original version of this, is it's possible to switch between different models. You can see currently it defaults to an Llama model and it's Gemma 3. Now I've got it rigged so that there's only 3 choices. Now remember, with these, when you're playing with a Llama, you will need to have a Llama installed and have the models downloaded. I'll show you in a moment which models I'm using. And also this particular program uses Google Gemini. And so in order to use Google Gemini, you will need a key for that, an API key. Now how I do it on my system is I define the API key within my environment variables, and then so I can pull them out using this particular Python trick. And that way I'm not sort of revealing my API key when I do these videos. So you would need, what I'm getting to here is, to use the Gemini models you would need to have a Gemini API key, and as you've seen in previous episodes, I've sort of gone through in more detail how you do that. So I would suggest you watch a previous episode where I've been doing tiny experiments in Gemini or Llama to see how you set things up, but I'm not going to be doing that in this episode. Now you'll see here we've got a list of experiments. Usually I do about 10, there's slightly more than that here, and they're grouped by different types of reflection. And the reason why I did this was I was looking at the whole issue of explainability with LLMs. And as a consequence, I sort of went down a reflection rabbit hole in this idea of having 2 passes. So the original question and the original request, and then a follow-up reflective question about the answer from that, and to see sort of where that takes you. And there's lots of different ways you can do that, and these probably cover some of them, not all of them, but some of them. And some are probably the main ones that come up as well. Now just to show you how to switch between the different sets of models, you can see the default up here. The default for the Llama model is Gemma 3. The default for the Gemini model is Gemini 2.5 Flash. It defaults to using a Llama, but it's pretty easy to swap that over. I mean, you could swap over in the hard code if you wanted to do that, but there is this feature in here where you can go into this S submenu, which is the selection submenu, and you can switch between using, for instance here, between using an Llama model or a Gemini model. So supposing we switch to a Gemini model, it'll just switch over to using Gemini, and you can see it defaults to Flash. If we want to select a particular Gemini model to use, we just use the same S menu and we go down to Configure Gemini Model, and there we can just actually configure is probably a bad word here for this. I'm probably a better choice of words would be set, actually, or select. So I think I'll change that before I upload that. I took some additional coding out where that made more sense, but I think what I'll do is I'll change that before I upload it to GitHub to select instead of configure. I'm doing configurations in a follow-up video, so that's why I took this out for a different scenario. Anyway, it shows you how hot off the press this is. So let me just leave it on 5 for the moment. But anyway, that's how you switch backwards and forwards and around in the different models. You'll get the hang of it. It's a little bit clunky, but it does the job. So I'm going to use Gemini 2.5 Flash. Be careful when you're selecting different models. It is possible to use up a sort of allocation. Certain models have a number of times you can use them in a certain period. And I found already, although it's not in here, I've managed to blow through my 2.5 Pro allocation, which does reload. But the 1.5 Flash, actually, the 1.5 Flash also has a restriction on it as well. It's a lot earlier model, but it actually has a lower restriction than the 2.5, which is more recent. And so if I was to select 1.5 for this particular experiment, it would come back and say that I've used up my my allowance. So I've just got to wait for that to reload. Anyway, back to the job in hand. So let's run 1.1. If I put in one that's not on the list, so if I just put in 1, which is the grouping, then I'm going to get it repeat this to repeat the menu, because it's not a valid choice. So let's do 1.1. I'll go away, and then I'll walk you through the basic layout of the code. Like I said, this is a good one to sort of roll your sleeves up and dive in and make changes. So the first question, or the first experiment, revolves around a simple thing around what is the primary food source of pandas and where do they typically live. And then it says review your previous answer. Now this is, of course, assuming you have a knowledge that it's going to come back and say, yeah, pandas primarily eat bamboo. But then it's saying, well, did you accurately state the only thing they eat? Are there any nuances or exceptions to their diet? And of course you could mix that up, have a different initial question, have a different reflection prompt. But essentially it's going, what's the answer to this question? And then going, well, yeah, but is there any more? So there we go. So a little more there in the self-reflection answer. And you can see it always confirms, like, so you're sure what it's running. With this particular version of an experiment, there's one thing I'm not doing, which I normally do here, and that's these aren't being saved to MD files, which is why this stops here. So if you wanted to, you can copy the contents of the experiment. Just opted not to do that in this particular set of experiments. So we're going to return to the main menu, and we could go through all of these if we wanted to, and I could run them all, but I'm not going to waste your time here. But we will switch over to a model in Llama. So let's do that, and we will just use Gemma 3 here. We could switch between the different models, but we'll just use Gemma 3, and I'll just show you the difference in the speed. Let's run the same one. Okay, so this is going to take longer. I'm running on my machine locally, but of course it's not as meaty as the machines that would be up on the cloud that Google Gemini has access to. So even though this is running locally, because I'm using a Llama, it's going to take a lot longer. So while that's doing that, we'll just go through this code quickly. Excuse me. So we've got the API configuration. There's some library imports going on. There is also some configuration variables here. There's various ways you can do that. You could sort of define a class and do some clever things with class and abstract it away in various ways, but we're not going to do that here. We've got an LLM interaction function which actually handles both models, a Llama and Gemini, but as a consequence it does have to do a little bit of repackaging for the Gemini because the structure of the RESTful API request is slightly different that it sends there. So there's a bit of role content shenanigans going on and some reformatting of the different parts into a slightly different structured JSON, but it is all JSON to do this. You'll also notice I am leaning into both the Llama library and the Google Generative AI library. I'm not doing any sort of roll your sleeves up raw requests here, which I do sometimes do in some of the episodes, so I'm leaning into that. All the experiments form roughly the same pattern here, and then we've got each experiment is its own function where the experiment's sort of abstracted away inside of the function. And so what happens here is we're passing in to the function that does the response, initially the initial question and then the reflection question, and we're getting the responses, we're getting the answers. And you know, the previous function here takes care of, you know, however it needs to reformat this particular structure to fit in with the particular type of LLM it's using, or the source of the LLM, whether it's through a Llama running locally or through the Google Gemini API. So that first one's pretty straightforward, and you can see as we go down we've got an experiment in logical consistency checks. Again, these are all sort of self-reflective. We have initial scenario or question. You can see some are a little bit more complicated than others. They sort of maybe push together a couple of parts of the prompt. And then we have a reflection prompt here. And you can see the structure looks very, very similar as was indicated up here. But we're just sort of swapping out for different sort of things we're doing based on, you know, altering the initial question, altering the reflection prompt, things like that. So we have assumption and identification validation experiment, an elaboration detailing experiment, a addressing emissions scope expansion experiment. So it's all two parts, but it always goes through the same model for both parts. We have a nuance and context addition, simplification, clarification check, a structure and flow optimization, conciseness review, bias detection and mitigation, audience appropriateness, credibility and authority assessment, alternative viewpoint solution, identifying limitations, edge cases, and that's it. And you can see here's the answer, and if we go back to the main, so you can see here this is the answer from the Llama Gemini one, and you know we previously got up here, but all the time once we've done it there's just this enter just to hold it on screen so it doesn't get pushed off by the menu when it comes up. That's all that is there for. And yeah, really that's it. I don't know if I want to add any more. We'll just do the last one. I've been through the whole lot a couple of times, but you know. So I do the Llama Gemini for the last one. It's a lot faster if you obviously run the Google Gemini stuff. So Gemma, if you're curious, so Gemma 3 is the open source version that Google Gemini released. actually it is also available through the API in various forms. And in a later episode, I'm going to do a little bit about how you can get a list of models that are available through an API key if you have one. So that's something to look forward to into a future episode where we dive a bit deeper into some Gemini related stuff. Again, because I have done Gemini before, but it's interesting to revisit because there's been a whole lot of different models come out now. And at some point I want to play around with the text-to-speech stuff and the video generation as well through a wrapper. So we'll see where we go with that. So as I've said, quite a little bit slow while that's running. I don't think there's anything else much to add. Very simple dictionary thing here for the names of the experiments. We've probably could clean this up a bit as well. I've got various redundancy in there to do with the sort of naming of stuff as part of the documentation. You don't have to necessarily have the documentation in there if you don't want to. And you can see here we've got our initial answer, and then it's going to go away and look up the sort of refined, the self-reflective answer basing on that. You can make some interesting modifications here. You could actually have it here you can see it actually says what it's running before it runs the experiment here. So it is pulling in that information from here, which is just a dictionary. But like I said, there's room for refactoring and removing some redundancy as well if you wanted to. But this is very much a fairly early pass of this particular thing that I wanted to just get out there and share so people can start playing around with it. So it's whirring away. Here's our very basic main menu display, which is actually packaged up differently, separate from main. You could have it in main and do away with the function if you wanted to. And there's fairly minimal error checking going on here. Again, you could do some more elaborate stuff if you wanted to. There is a timeout on the Gemini side of things. I found personally it's not a good idea to set a timeout for the alarm stuff unless you set it really high. But the Gemini stuff just there as a safety measure because we are, going over the web. So response should be faster overall, but just in case there's a connection problem because we are being connected to the internet. With the Alarma one, it's more going to be a problem because Alarma isn't running. So yeah. Go back to the main menu and you can see they're all listed here. So there we have it. Thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in a future episode.